Hello, I'm Dango Rose. Welcome to the Mountaineer Podcast, where everybody's listening. The Mountaineer brings you the latest news of the Peak to Peak region, in print, online, through our podcast, social media, and special publications. Now, listen in to the latest news of the area with our local journalists.
Hello, my name is Jamie Lammers, and welcome to a mega episode of the Mountaineer Podcast celebrating National Poetry Month. I'm bringing you an interview this time around from March 26th, 2023. I recorded this last year and did not have the chance to actually bring it to you guys on the podcast. So I thought I would bring it to you now to celebrate National Poetry Month once again. And this interview is with local ward poet Mike Parker. I apologize, there are quite a few background noises throughout the course of the interview. My phone buzzes a couple of times, there are slams on the table. Things along those lines are prevalent throughout this recording, and there's nothing I can do to remove them. So I apologize for that, but hopefully that doesn't take away from the rest of the interview. I also started recording a smidge late because we got right into the conversation, so I didn't have time to press record immediately. So we start kind of in the middle of the backstory, but I'm glad I caught what I did because this is an awesome interview, and I hope you guys enjoy. A fair warning, this episode is also pretty political and contains some censored swear words. You have been warned.
I'm particularly a kid out of high school. I was not very educated on the level of going to school and stuff, so I went to school at night while I worked days for a year, and then I went to the University of New Haven, which was called New Haven College back then, and it was a community college, which was a really great place because I'd say at least a quarter of its faculty were graduate students from Yale, kids getting their PhD at Yale, and a lot of it was a young faculty, very hip and from a completely different class than I was from, but very willing to bring us along as students. They were so much more highly educated than community college kids, but just willing to go out of their way to turn us on to stuff and to bring us up to a level where you could survive as a student in college, because we were mostly pretty working class kids. There was a good engineering program there was a business program there, and they had just started a liberal arts faculty and stuff, which is what I was interested in. So that took me out of my hometown mind, and at the same time I was beginning to read all the beat writers, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, and all the beat writers from the 60s who were still centered in Greenwich Village in New York City. And I had a guy that really mentored me there named Bertrand Matthew, who was an English teacher, and he knew I was beginning to write poetry, and he turned me on to a whole world of literature. He was friends with the writer Henry Miller. He was translating the French poet Rimbaud for City Lights books, which was run by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, which was the avant-garde beat publisher out of San Francisco. And so Bert turned me on to a lot of stuff, and I was a poor kid, and I lived in a real dive little apartment, but right across the street from Yale University. And so I used Yale as much as I could. Their bookstore was incredible. I could go in and use their library. I couldn't take books out, but I could go read there, and I could mingle among a class of people and kids that I had never been around before, which was uplifting. And I had a friend of mine that I grew up with that went to the University of New Haven and who worked in the stacks there, so he turned me on to a lot of stuff at Yale that was for free. I could sneak into the drama department at night. They have a world-class drama theater, and I could watch what was going on there and see. I think Meryl Streep was one of the young actresses there, and so I got turned on to a lot of stuff like that. And at the same time, I started hanging out in Greenwich Village on weekends and stuff because that's where the whole beat world was, and I didn't know a lot of people there, but I could take the train down there for a day or a night, and so my world was expanding. And Bert was turning me on to lots and lots of poets, so I just fell in love with all kinds of poetry and poets, and I started writing a lot, and I ended up getting a theater scholarship there. I started acting in the plays there, and so financially that helped me out a lot. I became an actor, and I got a theater scholarship for a couple of years, which made going to school a lot easier. And it was also the time of the Vietnam War. And at that period in history, if you went to college, you were exempt from the draft. And my brother, who was a couple of years younger than me, got drafted, and he was an MP, basically a bodyguard for officers in Vietnam, had been hurt over there a couple of times, and I was dead set against the war. At that school, it was fairly conservative engineering school, and we were in quite a minority. There were more faculty members that were against the war than there were students, but I began to protest against the war and get very educated against the war, and saw the war as kind of a new form of colonialism. I soon learned that the basis of that war, we sent a lot of people over here, a lot of kids got killed over there, but if you went to school, you were privileged and you didn't get drafted. So that was a very hard nut for me to swallow, because I came out of a neighborhood and my own brother was over there. And so I began feeling the negative parts of that privilege being a student. And I started going to New York and participating in demonstrations there, and I made some friends in New York. And so that aspect of my life was magnified. And I left college just before my last year because I wanted to go to graduate school at Columbia University, but I gave up that privilege. I thought it was wrong that I was privileged and people in my own family and the kids I grew up with were getting shot over there. And so I left college and I moved to New York City, and I had a girlfriend down there, and she lived on the Lower East Side, and it was very cheap to live back then. It was a much rougher neighborhood than it is now. It wasn't gentrified at all. It was Puerto Rican and Ukrainian, but it was also the heart of a lot of the beat scene and writers who I had been reading. I watched walk down the street every day, and the woman I lived with, Pat Jackson, had been part of that scene for a long time. Knew people like Timothy Leary. The whole LSD thing was huge. It was part of the anti-war movement. So I became even more politicized there and met a lot of artists there and published some of my first poems there in small magazines, and just fell in love with that whole life and lifestyle. The first week I got there, I got a job because I needed to get a job right away. I got a job in a place called Brentano's Bookstore, which was in the middle of Greenwich Village on East 8th Street, the largest paperback bookstore in the world. One huge floor of paperbacks and a small floor of hardbacks. And down the street was the 8th Street Bookstore, which was world famous for publishing every week. This huge window was filled with brand new broadsides and small magazines, and it was the center of the Beat generation. Every week there was a fantastic amount of new books coming out, and so that world was on fire. And the first day I got a job there, I got a job with a guy who started the same day. His name was Robert Mapplethorpe, and he became one of the most famous photographers in the world. And he had just met Patti Smith, who was his new girlfriend, and they became two of my closest friends. So after work, we'd share money and share a joint and run around the village at night and hang out at the Cedar Tavern, and we just immersed ourselves in that art world. And I did that for a while, and then because I left school, I got a draft notice, and I applied to become a conscientious objector. And so I went through that whole thing, and it was extremely hard to win that status at that point. Muhammad Ali was the most famous person who was also doing it at the same time. They had taken his title away, and he basically said, I'm not going over there, and I'm not going to kill people I don't know for all the wrong reasons.
It's here that Parker talked to me about the fact that Muhammad Ali was once quoted as saying, "No Viet Cong ever called me a racial epithet." Now, I found an interesting article on Slate.com by Stefan Fatsis saying that this really wasn't said at the time that people thought he said it. It was eventually attributed to Ali, and he ended up using it later on in regards to other interviews that he did and a movie that he was involved in, and it was even quoted in Will Smith's movie Ali. But it was not necessarily a quote at the time that it was attributed to him. I just thought that was interesting.
And so I felt like I was aligned with some pretty fantastic people, and the anti-war movement was huge in Greenwich Village. There were demonstrations every night, and I ended up winning my status as a conscientious objector. I had to go back to my hometown to face the draft board. Had a guy on there that was from my neighborhood that ran a drugstore. So these people were dead set against me winning that war. They just berated me, called me a communist, asked me all kinds of questions. To them, I was a coward. But my friend Bert Matthew, my professor from school, came to my hearing. While I was in New York, I visited a lawyer named Leonard Boudin, who was the most famous left-wing lawyer in New York, and he interviewed me and told me what this route was going to be like and suggested that I go talk to the Quakers in Greenwich Village who were good at preparing you for these hearings. And so I did some of that. I was quite prepared. But during the hearing, these people were so out of line and so vehement and so full of very hateful things that the hearing just blew up. And basically during the hearing at one point, I told them to go themselves, and that really made the hearing blow apart. But what it did is it caused them to break every single rule of the hearing, and they wouldn't let me have any witnesses, but it got so out of control they let me call in Bert Matthew as my witness, who basically told them I have some of this on tape, and he read them all the rules that they had broken for the hearing. And of course they got scared. I don't think they had ever had a hearing like that before. They had never dealt with a conscientious objector before, and so I won. They gave me that status to get rid of me and to keep it quiet, and then I had to get a job. So if you don't get a job, you go to jail after your conscience objector. So they make it extremely hard to get a job. And so I was in New York City. They wanted to assign me to a mental hospital in Middletown, Connecticut, which was a horrible, horrible place. So I refused to do that, but then I had to get a job. Every place I applied, no place would hire me. They didn't want to hire a conscience objector. And so there were two churches in Greenwich Village, and one was on West 4th Street, and I went there, and they didn't really have any openings. So I went to the most famous Peace Church, which is on Washington Square Park in the middle of Greenwich Village, and I was living on the Lower East Side at the time with Pat Jackson, and it was a place called Judson Memorial Church. It was the most radical church in the United States. They had an underground abortion agency, and it was a Christian church, but they had a hospital in Puerto Rico where they flew people. They had it set up. They would send a church member with the person who was going to get this procedure done. The main body of the church had become one of the most famous off-Broadway theaters in New York City. The other part of the church was Merce Cunningham, who was one of the most famous dancers in the world, had his whole troupe. They were the resident dancers there. There was a small art gallery that showed famous abstract artists there, and it was an anti-war church. So I went in and applied, and I talked to the secretary, and she basically said, we can't help you. There are no more jobs here. We just filled our last job. They had 4 conscientious objectors that they took in that worked for the church. And so I told them, well, they're going to send me to jail, and you got to help me out. And so the minister heard me kind of making a ruckus, talking to his secretary, and he came out and he said, come in here. And he was this big guy with a crew cut that looked really, really straight, but he was the radical mind behind this church. And he told me there are no jobs, and I said, well, they're going to send me to jail. And he said, well, when are they going to send you to jail? And I said, I'm going to hear from them in the next week or two. And so he said, well, we don't have a job, but I'm going to make a job. So what do you do? I told him I work in a bookstore. He said, well, oh, great. So we have a small offset printing press. Do you know how to run a printing press? And I said, no. And he said, well, you're going to learn. He said, so you have to live at the church. Next to the church, attached to the church, there was an old Civil War hospital. It had like 30 small rooms in it. And so he took me over there and he said, you come back this weekend and you're going to get a room, and this is where you're going to live. And we'll have somebody teach you how to run the printing press, and we'll figure out what to do with you later. But in the meantime, you're going to be safe. And so I packed my bags from my girlfriend's apartment, and I went over there, and he took me upstairs, and he said, pick out a room. So there were 3 floors. He showed me around all 3 floors, and he told me there's going to be another project that's going to be here, and so you're going to be living with some people. But I said, I'll take this room right here. It was at the top of the stairs. And he said, oh, we had an artist in residence that just moved out of there 2 nights ago. Her name was Yoko Ono. Did you ever hear Yoko Ono? I hadn't heard of her then. And he said, well, this is a good luck room because she was a great anti-war activist, and she's gone on to do some other things. She got some grants and stuff, but she still lives in the village. So I moved in there, and then he said, I want you to meet this guy named Arthur Levin, and he's part of our church group. He's our grant writer. He's getting ready to do a new project, but he makes sure the conscientious objectors that are going to be living here have a decent life, and he's kind of your boss. And so I met Arthur Levin, and slowly I went to work on the printing press and everything. And then I went back there at night, and then Arthur Levin told me, well, we have a new project that's going to start here. And it's a project we're going to take in runaway children. Kids were taking LSD all over the United States, and they were running away from home. And they were either going to San Francisco or New York City. So there were lots of kids on the street, and they saw the need to deal with these kids in a constructive way because they were prey in New York City. These were the most naive kids from Iowa, from everywhere in the country. But the big city life was a whole other ballgame. And so they were starting this project. It was illegal to work with runaway children. children. But the church had been partially funded by a guy named Stuart Mott from the Stuart Mott Foundation, a multimillionaire food family. And Stuart was the younger guy in that family, and he was interested in funding things. He partially funded that abortion agency. He was interested in funding things that if you could show a record of the good that they did, you could convince some politicians to change the law and make them legal, turn them into social work instead of something that was illegal. And so that was the idea behind this project. And so I lived there, and the project started, and there was a woman named Bev Waite who lived on the second floor. There was an apartment there that she had lived in. She was a member of that church and a radical woman for years. And she was married to a guy named Ralph Waite. They had just lost a daughter to cancer. And Ralph Waite, he was a minister, and he decided his whole trip with God was a losing thing and decided to become an actor. And so he was going to acting school with a guy named Al Pacino, and they were young guys and young actors, but him and Bev were going through a divorce, but they were best friends. So he would come by the runaway house, and so she was kind of in charge of running this project, and I was working every day, but at night when I came back, they just started getting these runaway kids, and so I started volunteering and doing it, and frankly, I was at least as good or better at it than most other people. And of course, I had already taken LSD, and a lot of these kids were, and so the language that was applicable to this situation and the camaraderie and the whole hippie philosophy, they hired me to be part of that project. I used to make $50 a month is what I was paid as a conscientious objector. But I got my meals there, and I got a room there, and I worked with 3 other people that were conscientious objectors, and they had different jobs in the church. And one of the guys who I had started taking a Greek course in college was a conscientious objector, and he showed up there, and he became the cook. So I had a new life there, and so to be a CO, you had to work for 2 years. Well, this project got bigger and bigger and bigger, and one day Stuart Mott came to visit the project, and Arthur Levin, who I worked for, was friends with Stuart Mott and applied for some funding to him, and Stuart Mott wrote a large check for well over $100,000 for the project. So we had money to open up crash pads on the Lower East Side where kids could stay in and out. We funneled kids through the house. There was all those empty rooms in the house. Part of the philosophy of the house became an experiment in taking some of these kids in off the street and giving them a room to live in and forming an extended family, and still funneling other kids in who only stayed there for 2 or 3 nights. If they wanted to go home, we called their families in, and we had a psychiatrist from Bellevue Hospital who would be part of it and covered the legal aspects of it and the social aspects of it, and made the families feel like this was a real thing instead of just a hippie project. And so that project went on, and I did that for 2 years, and the second year we kind of ran out of money. We had used a lot of that money. At one point, the Grateful Dead came to New York City, and they played a benefit for us in a small place in Greenwich Village and gave us enough money so I could continue to feed these kids and put them up. And my whole world had expanded in a huge way then. And so when my time was up and I didn't get to see Robert Mapplethorpe and Patti Smith near as much, they had moved into the Chelsea Hotel in New York, and they were hanging out with the Warhol crowd and the whole beginning of the whole punk rock world. And Patti was just starting to transform her poetry into music then. And Robert was becoming famous, and Robert had come out as gay, and they had split as a couple then, but they were best friends. And so I saw them when I could, and I was involved in a whole new world of artists and writing like crazy and starting to perform my poetry in the village. And after that, my time was up, and a friend turned me on to a place up in the Catskill Mountains. When my 2 years were up, my boss gave me some money. I bought a backpack. I took a bus up to the Catskills. I lived in this cabin. I spent most of the winter there by myself, not seeing anybody. It was miles and miles, off the end of a dirt road, which they didn't plow for most of the winter. And for a long time, I lived by myself and didn't see anybody. I ate the same food every day that I had backpacked in. I bought a little bag of weed with me. I wrote a lot. I walked as much as I could. I didn't have the best clothes in the world, but that winter helped transform my mind, and I got to know myself in a whole new level. I didn't talk to people, and I bought a pile of books and I read them over and over. They were all poets, and I wrote a lot. And shortly after that, some of the people I lived with and worked with in New York City, the friends that I had made, came to the Catskills, and we got to use a piece of land way up in the woods, and we built a cabin like a half-mile up in the woods further from where I first stayed that winter in the cabin. And we had a communal life, a small group of people, about 6 or 7 people. We built this cabin and we lived up there, and it was a political time. The Weather Underground, I don't know if you know about them, but they were the most radical group, and so we were associated associated with them. So we had a lot of heat from the FBI and from J. Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI then, and he was a really strange human being. And it was really a time where the country was split, but the younger generation was really tight and of a different culture. And I went through all that. And I did a lot of traveling in Canada, and I came out here to visit a friend. She was staying in this town here, and I visited here, and I still maintained my life in the Catskills, but I started staying out here more, and I fell in love with these mountains. And over the years, I had gotten to know a lot of the people who had been my heroes, Allen Ginsberg, a number of the beat writers. I got to know some of them in New York. I got to work with Allen on a prison project in upstate New York, and Naropa University was just starting in Boulder. And so that was Allen's project, really. He'd become friends with the Lama Chogyam Trungpa, and Ann Waldman and Allen were best friends from the Poetry Project in New York City on the Lower East Side, St. Mark's Poetry Project. So a lot of those people started coming. The early stages of Naropa was very small, and Allen was bringing out a lot of his friends. And Allen was world famous and published in lots of languages and was making a living and sharing whatever he had with a lot of his friends that weren't making a living but were famous and starving. But that's what grew Naropa into a beautiful place. They had a summer writing program, and so I knew some of these people from New York City. And at the same time, I met a woman named Bonnie Schulman, who was Allen's student and had moved out here from New York City with her boyfriend, a guy named Phil Dubitsky, and they were students at Naropa, and we became part of the writing program at the Boulder County Jail. Bonnie and I ran a writing workshop there for the prisoners, and Allen and Peter Orlovsky's boyfriend came and read there a couple of times, and so Allen turned all the New York poets onto it, so they came to that workshop. And if you wanted to study with Allen, one of the requirements was you had to come to the workshop and read your poems if you were a student. And so that poetry workshop really expanded. I bought a lot of ward poets down there. We published some books from there. Some people couldn't even read when we encountered them, and we encouraged all of that. And our writing workshops were great, and we did that for a couple of years. And the poetry scene in Ward got bigger and bigger. There was a guy named Gregory Tebrick here, and the next phase was we built the Ward Library. Ward had been a gold mining town. There was a very young generation of people here who was very educated, and at the back of the town hall we were given a space there to build a library. And Gregory Tebrick was the main mover and shaker in that, and a woman named Jean Plus went into this big empty room and built shelves and places to put books and performance spaces. And so the library was born and became this incredible poetry scene, which just developed right up to this day for almost the past 45 years or so. And Allen and a lot of Naropa people came to read up there, and when people came to perform there, they came up here to read. And so we've had a lot of world-class poets that have read in that little library. And Allen gave Phil Dubitsky and I a printing press. They had just gotten a new press at Naropa, and Phil was educated as a printer, grew up in that business in New York City, and actually got a degree in printing from a school in upstate New York. And so we started publishing Ward poets. We published a lot of people from Ward. I have a lot of those books. And we published 2 magazines from the jail of people, inmates writing. And Allen let us publish the first 2 copies of something that was called Bombay Gin, which became a world-class magazine, which was all the people that studied at Naropa University and all of Allen's beat friends from San Francisco and New York. So we got to publish our own work in there and some local people and get to meet all these people. And the poetry scene grew more and more here. And the Ward Library was given this cabin that was over 100 years old. It was on mining property. So the cabin was a gift to us to be an artist in residence. And so I was the first artist in residence program as far as the Ward Public Library. And that was in like 1977. So the deal was you could stay there for 2 years. You could use the library as your venue. You could apply for grants. You needed to have an effect on the population of Ward. So there were a lot of young artists in Ward. It was a wild town then. The 70s were a whole other era. It was a psychedelic era. People showed up. It was a very young population. It was very unmarried. People didn't have kids yet. But it was a great place. The town had been resettled by a kind of hippie generation. And there was an old lady who lived here, Hazel Schmall, who grew up in this town. When she was a kid, there were 2,000 gold miners living in this town. There were a couple of whorehouses. There were 3 big hotels. It was a wild place. And slowly that went away. Hazel, after her teenage years, she went to school at the University of Chicago and she became a botanist. After that, she came back here and she pioneered Arctic botany on Niwot Ridge, the mountain above town. one of her best friends that she hung out with here was Georgia O'Keeffe, the painter. So Georgia spent some time in Ward and fell in love with Ward, and she and Hazel would ride their horses to Estes Park to go dancing. There were no roads up to the Brainerd Lake area. They would ride their horses up there. They would ride their horses on Niwot Ridge, and Georgia did a lot of watercolors, and she did a very famous painting of the Ward Church in the center of town, which is one of her early famous paintings. And so Ward has a strong background in the arts, and it went from gold mining to that. And then with my generation that came to here, the arts flourished, and poets from all over the United States came here to read. And so I did my 2 years as the artist in residence, and before I left, I wanted to do something big. In the meantime, the martial arts grew here, and we all studied martial arts, taekwondo, with a great teacher named Dan Swenson. And so Phil Dubitsky and I, through various means, selling various substances, saved a bunch of money, and we threw a poetry festival. We planned this poetry festival, and we bought people who we had met. I had bought some Ward artists to San Francisco to perform because I'd been performing out there, so I had great connections out there. So we contacted artists all over the United States that we knew, and we invited them to come to Ward for a week, and we would pay their way here, and we would put each one of them up with a family and give the family money for whatever they needed: hot food, entertainment. And we threw a poetry and kickboxing festival for a whole week. And where the children's playground is now in Ward, we built the boxing ring, and it was a big natural amphitheater. So there was a week of music and poetry in the Ward Library, poetry up at the Millside Inn up on the highway, and boxing matches at night, kickboxing matches. And everybody in this entire area turned out that week to watch and participate. It was wild. And it was this great festival, and it was free, and Phil and I somehow were able, Phil was a genius at financing things in various ways, and it went on for a week, and it was incredible. And nobody here had ever seen anything like that before. And poetry and kickboxing worked really fine together. And we had this great time. And then I decided my time was up, and at the end of that festival, I was going to leave. And I left, and I went back to New York City. And I had done some big readings in Boulder and Naropa, and I took my poetry, I felt like, as far as it was going to go here. I wanted to do something new, so I knew New York was on fire then, and I went back to New York City. I had a lot of friends from the Greenwich Village days there. I had places to stay, and one of my friends from here that rode back in the car with us, there was 4 of us that drove back there. His name was Jeff Frund, and we went back there. We got jobs there and stuff, and one of my friends put me up in a loft on the Lower East Side. There were a few people living there. One of them was a guy named Mike Herenick, who was a fantastic musician. He had just been playing in a band that had split up, and so he said, well, let's take some of the poetry and put it to music. And so we started screwing around at night and doing that, and pretty soon Jeff, who I'd never known was a great guitar player and bass player, came and started playing with us. And then one of the guys that I'd stay in touch with, that was a kid at that runaway house, showed up in the village again, and he was a drummer when he was a kid, so he bought his drum set, and we started playing, and we formed a band called the Ballistic Kisses. And these guys were all fairly accomplished musicians, and I knew nothing about music, but I was a poet. And so Patti Smith had taken that venue and was doing it, and Lou Reed had made that venue famous, and we got a small gig at a little club called Tier 3. We only had a few songs, but we were hanging out there anyway, and the lady that ran the bar let us come play a gig there, and it really went over. And so she invited us back, and we got to play there again, and I had been working part-time in a club uptown in New York called Haraz, kind of doing maintenance in the daytime, and the booking agent there had seen us play at Tier 3, and she invited us to play there, so we started playing out. And she was this wonderful woman, and one night she said, God, I love what you're doing. And I had written this anti-heroin poem, and she had seen a lot of people doing dope, and she really liked where we were coming from. And she said, I have a friend of mine that owns Beggar's Banquet Records in London, and he's looking to sign a band in New York. And I told him about you guys, so he's going to come see you play. And so she booked us, and he came and he saw us play, and we got a deal with Beggar's Banquet Records, and we went into the recording studio for the first time, and this is the record we put out.
For the podcast audience who can't see the cover that Mike Parker is showing me, the first album that Ballistic Kisses released was called Total Access.
A friend of mine produced it, who was a sound man in New York, and all the lyrics are in there and everything. And it was pretty radical political music for New York City. And I was, at the time, becoming friends with The Clash, the band from London, and I did some kickboxing beatboxing with the drummer from the Clash, Topper Headon. And so our world was expanding. And so we put out this first record and we put poetry to music. And we did 2 albums with Beggars Banquets and some singles. This was our second album.
For the podcast listeners, the second album that Ballistic Kisses released was called Wet Moment.
And this became a little more pop music. The cover was done by a guy named David Wojnarowicz. Meantime, I was working in a nightclub when we weren't playing music called Danceteria. The artist Keith Haring, I don't know if you know him, became one of the most famous artists in the world. He worked there. Madonna was the coat-check girl. There was a woman named Zoe Leonard, who's one of the most famous photographers in the world now, was the other coat-check girl. A lot of people on the staff became world famous. Jean-Michel Basquiat was hanging out there, and so he was hanging out at the club called Tier 3, and so I knew all these people, and our world really blew up. And so I led that life for a while. I'll show you my last book. I have a poem about Basquiat ODing. I found him on the street, OD'd and unconscious one night. When I was a doorman in this club, Tier 3, somebody came and said, there's a guy dead on the sidewalk up there. So I ran up there, and my friend from my band, Jeff Frun, had just come to the club early at night to hang out with me before the club opened. And we ran up there, and it was Basquiat. So he had OD'd, and he was on the street. I didn't write this for years. This was in my last book, but I found him on the street and threw him over my shoulder, and Jeff stopped a cab and carried him into St. Vincent's Hospital, and they saved his life. And it was before he sold his first painting, but it was just part of that world. And I just got to meet so many wonderful people. I'd already met Muhammad Ali when I was applying to be a conscientious objector, so there's a poem in that book about Ali. And the Ballistic Kisses got to participate in some movies. In the music world, we did our second album over in London, and we became part of that whole music scene in New York. It was the time of Blondie and the Talking Heads and all the punk bands, and it was a different life we led. And those things come and go, and at the end of that life, my parents were getting sick. My dad was dying of cancer. My mom was ill. I left that world. I had just seen a movie we were in at the Museum of Modern Art. We were in a little movie with this guy, Ruben Blades, called Crossover Dreams, and I went from that to working on the docks in New Haven and taking care of my family. I worked in a liquor warehouse. I unloaded 16 trucks a day. So it went from being the rock and roll world to being on stage in front of big crowds of people and living a whole other life and seeing yourself in movies, to back to being a working class kid in my hometown and deflating that whole balloon, and back to the reality of my family and my parents. Took care of my dad till he died, and one of the last things my dad asked me is, who's going to take care of my wife? And so I told him, I got you covered. My mom lived for another 9 years. I led a whole other life in my hometown, which is a really tough place. Bartended, worked in a clothing store, sold men's suits, worked on the docks, unloaded trucks, back to reality in a different way. Still maintained my friendships with my friends in New York. Once in a while I would jump on the train, go back, walk in Tower Records, take a look at my albums there. My life had been split into very different worlds. I still maintain all my friendships with people here. When I used to play in New York City at Christmas or New Year's Eve, some of my friends here would come out and come to my shows. And so through all of that, I maintained my family ties with my extended family in Ward. And when my mom passed away, one of my friends out here, I called and told them that, and they sent me a plane ticket, and they said, come back and do another 2 years as an artist in residency. Start all over again, publish some books. And so I came back. My friend Phil Dubitsky was still here. We had stayed best friends through the whole music life in New York. He used to come and hang out with me in New York a lot. I came back here, and we still had that small printing press that Allen Ginsberg had given us. We started publishing more books of Ward people, and then I published this book, my second time as the artist in residence, Don't Fall Off the Mountain. So collected poems from my early days in New York City to the time I came back here. So I got back here in about 1996, and so the first part of the book is a lot of my old poems from my early days here. And the second part of the book, some of these poems there was a 2-year period in the Ward government where we formed our own court system. We had our own cops here. We have our own fire department here. We built all that. And so these are the 2 town cops, and I was the judge. So I was a police magistrate and had credentials from Boulder County. And I only did it to show people the theatrics and the mechanics of how to run a night court. But then they didn't have a judge, so they elected me. And so I did that. And there's a lot of poems in here from them. There's a picture of the local guys building the Ward firehouse. So this is the early part of the book, early history of Ward, a lot of local history in here, a lot of political poems here. This was about a guy who was on the 10 most wanted list who got busted. He had been a gold miner that blew up the power lines in the Coors factory because Coors was making porcelain nose cones for guided missiles in Vietnam. So these are the early parts, and then so the book is in 3 parts, and there's a short second part here. So these are called Pavement Dweller Poems, Ballistic Kisses lyrics. This is the Ballistic Kisses. This is me, this is the drummer, the guitar player, and the keyboard player. So some of these poems are from that era. Lyrics, some of them which I wrote here in the early days that I turned into. There's a poem called here, European Ashes. And so this is the second part of the book, and then there's a lot of pictures in here. The third part of the book are the poems I wrote when I came back here from 96 to 98, and there's a lot of Ward history in there. So that's the first book. I'm going to show you the 4 books, okay? Phil and I started a press called Despair Press. We call it Despair Press. Despair spelled D''S-P-A-R-E. And we called it that because when we had gone to Naropa, Alan said, I want you to come down here. I want to show you. We just got this brand new printing press. It's incredible. We're going to run a big press and everything. And this was in the early days of Naropa. So there was their old offset press sitting there. So Phil said, Alan, what are you going to do with that press? Alan said, well, I don't know what we're going to do with it. We got this new press here and I wanted to show it to you guys. And he was all excited. And so Phil said, well, I'll tell you what, I'm a printer. And Alan knew he was a printer. And he had studied, him and Bonnie Shulman, from the days in the jail workshops. Alan knew about us being poets. So Phil said, I'll tell you what, Mike and I are going to pick that press up and we're going to carry it out of here. And we're going to take it to Ward and we're going to print poets. And Alan said, great, it's yours. So he gave us the press. So we called it Despair Press. Not like in despair, the feeling, but in like spare, like a spare tire. It was their spare press and he gave it to us. So that's what we named our press. And we started publishing a lot of people from Ward. And on that press, we published those first 2 Bombay gins from Naropa. And Alan was so happy that we were using that press and he made us part of that world. So that was the first book. This was the second book I published like 5 or 6 years later called The Wallflower Sutra. And there's a lot of Ward poems in here. And this is the second book. When I came back from taking care of my parents, this is the second book I published here. And I always put a photograph in there that I came back here and I was climbing a lot of mountains. And Phil and I published this book, and the cover, the woman who I ended up marrying, I fell in love when I came back here, and I have a wife and family, and she and I climbed Mount Audubon in the winter in February. We had to stop 200 feet below the top because it turns into a dome of ice in the winter like now up there. But we didn't have ice axes, we didn't have our mountaineering gear, we just had poles and snowshoes. So we got about 200 feet from the top, and she said, what do you think? And I said, I think it's too dangerous. We got to make it home. And so she took this picture from the top of Mount Audubon in February. Nobody goes up there in the winter. The winds are crazy. We just hit it on a windless day. Vast amount of snow. But we snowshoed up there and we came home by headlamp at night. So that's the cover from this book. And then another 5 years later, about every 5 years, I was publishing a book because I like my work to be my life. And I wrote in journals all the time. But I throw a lot of stuff away. I sift through a lot of stuff. So this book, 5 years later, Walking on Water in a Razor Blade Breeze, is about snowshoeing. This is me on snowshoes, and I got to work with a great artist here. These are my actual snowshoes taken out on a long snowshoe hike. I got to work with a guy named Mike Wochuk, who is an artist and a great friend of mine. He drew this picture for the back cover. I worked with a woman named Jenna Sinisfet, who is a world-famous graphic artist who grew up in Ward and became famous in New York City, working for the Olympic Committee back there, became famous in New York as a graphic artist. When she moved back here, we got to work together on this, and I'd known her since she was a kid. So between her and Mike Wochuk, we produced this book. So it has a lot of Ward history in it. It's a lot of Ward poetry. And Barbara Lawler came and took pictures of me reading this, and this was reviewed in your newspaper. And there's a lot of Ward history and mountain life in here, and a lot of my poetry became based on nature. But I never lost my politics. So through this book, and this book, the politics are there. And then we come to the last book. My friend Phil Dubitsky, my publisher, died, and it was a huge loss in my life. A really close friend, my publisher, and one of the people who made the Ward poetry scene just wonderful. We published a lot of local people. So a huge loss in my life. But I got to know this guy who was a poet that lived here for a while named David Martin. And he was a young poet, and he worked with us out at this place called Gold Lake Ranch. Dutch. And he lived here for a couple of years. And then he moved to Durango, and he ran a big poetry scene down there in a coffee house. And he started a press, and it's called Middle Creek Publishing. And he has published now almost 40 poets, maybe more than 40 now. And he publishes really beautiful books. So he came to visit me and asked me if he could publish one of my books. And this is the last book, Kimono Mountain. You can see all the things in there right from one of my last readings in Ned. And so David and I got to publish this book, and the Basquiat poem is in there. There's a poem about Muhammad Ali in there. There's a Kimono Mountain poem in here about my life here. There's a lot of nature poems in here. There's political poems in here because Donald Trump had become president. He was running for office. And so I have a young daughter and a wife, and Trump was a terrible sexist and a fascist, and that's all in this book. So that's basically my publishing history. That's the music world history. And that's pretty much the part of my story I wanted to tell you. There's one more part I want to turn you on to. These people, I just got to publish this book. We just published this work. There's a great poet. I got some notes here. So this poet is Sandy Karn. She's lived here for like 40 years. And Marcelo Sosa, who's a great poet and very adept at the technology to publish books. We made the cover together for Sandy. We laid out the book together. These are her poems. And we formed another press, Amrita Press. So this is the first publication on it. We're going to do some more. So Ward again has a publishing house again. And this is Sandy's book.
For podcast listeners, Sandy Karn's book is called, appropriately enough, Amrita.
I want to turn you on to a couple of these other books. So Sandy is this great poet, and I know her from a reading in San Francisco, and she was one of the people that came to the Ward Poetry Festival and never left. She moved here, and she came with a couple of wonderful friends that were poets, and she stayed here and raised a family here. And so this is her book. And there's another guy I want to tell you about. His name is Zaylen Edwards, and he's a poet, and this is his first book.
For the podcast listeners, the book he's showing me is Zaylen Everest Edwards, Some Ins and Outs of What It's All About.
And he's transformed his poetry into music, much like the journey that I did in New York. Only he lives here, and I find him to have the best instincts of somebody like John Prine, Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan, except he's got his own voice. He's an incredible guitar player. He writes these beautiful songs, and so he has elevated poetry on a local level. He writes lots of poetry about local things and about all things in the world. He's married to a woman who's a bass player, and they have a young child, and they're making a life here, and he grew up here. So he's just fantastic. And so in some ways, besides talking about me in this interview, I would like you to talk about some of these newer people, because there's a whole new world, and I feel like it's part of my job as a poet to embrace them and include them in that world that I've gotten to experience. They're really wonderful. So there's one more guy here, Leaf Running Rabbit, his name is, and this is his book.
For podcast listeners, the book that he is showing me is Wild Bee, Poems, Praise, and Wild Prayers. He's credited on the book as One Leaf.
And he publishes with the same publishing house, Middle Creek Publishing, that I do. And he publishes online. He has a following of more than 16,000 people daily. He publishes a poem every day. And all these people tune into his world. And so he's taken that aspect of poetry and Ward and put it out there in the world in a way that I never did. And that's a big part of the world now, the internet. And so Leaf has done that. These are a group of poets from Netherlands that a lot of people in Netherlands are not totally aware of. There's a guy named Bert Roshbaum. I don't know if you know Bert. Bert is like the poet laureate of Netherlands. He works at the Carousel 4 days a week, and he sends in 30 poems a month to the world of publishing. And he's a single dad. His wife just passed away, and she ran the visitor center. Her name was Sharon. She was wonderful. And so she was a big part of Netherlands. And he's a big part of Netherlands. The Blue Owl Bookstore has been an incredible poetry scene for years and years. We've all read there and performed there. Zaylen performed there. I read my last book there. Bert has performed there many, many times. And it's one of the heart of the poetry scenes in Netherlands. Kimba, who owns that bookstore, has embraced local poets and ward poets. And we've all done lots of poetry there. And it slowed down during the whole COVID thing. But that's a good scene for you to know about, because the poetry scene will be starting there again. And Kimba has made poetry flourish in Netherlands. And so has the Mountaineer. Barbara came to all of these readings, all the readings in Ward, the readings at the Blue Owl Books, the readings at the Netherlands Netherland Library, and it's just great. Before where the Bagel House is now in that, there was a little poetry scene there years ago, and that was a famous folk scene. That's where the Yonder Mountain String Band and Leftover Salmon, String Cheese, and a lot of those bands started. And so we did some poetry scenes there, but Blue Owl Books really was the center of the scene in Netherland and probably will be again.
For the record, I do not believe that Mike actually showed me a book of Bert's, but if you want to buy a book of his poetry, Of the Carousel, Poems by Bert Rashbaum, is available on the Carousel of Happiness's website on carouselofhappiness.org. Speaking of the Carousel of Happiness, if you want to hear some thoughts from Scott Harrison, the founder of the Carousel of Happiness, I interviewed him very recently, so you can check out that episode if you want.
So I want to show you these books. There's a guy named Alexander Joseph who publishes in the Mountaineer a weekly column. This is his book.
For the record, the book that Mike is showing me now is Alexander Shalom Joseph's Our Mother, the Mountain.
He is a great artist, and he grew up in Netherland, in that area, and he's got a master's degree from Europa in poetry, and he came back and he lives here now. This was an early book he wrote about the Jewish background and the lineage he comes, and his grandfather immigrating to this country. And this is the book of the weekly columns from the Mountaineer. And Alexander reminds me of Jack Kerouac in so many ways, minus the drugs and the alcohol. He just has that spirit. He's a novelist. He's written quite a few novels. He's published a lot of books, and he is the up-and-coming voice of the mountains. He's just a great writer and a great person, and he publishes weekly in the Mountaineer. So I wanted you to see his stuff, and I want you to mention these people in this interview in these articles. And there's a couple of more I want to show you. There's a guy named Hoag Holgrim, this is his book. He's a great artist, and this is a book of early cave painting symbols that he has written poems about. And so he's a very studied artist. The whole book is all these symbols, and these are poems. And he's also a Zen teacher. He runs a Zendo now up in Rollinsville. He has a small Zendo there, and he's a Zen teacher, and he wrote this book called No Better Place. It's a new Zen book. I've read massive amounts of Zen books my whole life. I love to sit. And he is a great Zen teacher, and this is written as a prose poem, and it's just a great book. And last but not least, there's this great world-class translator that lives over on Sugarloaf and has taught at Europa for years. This is a guy that doesn't really toot his own horn, but he's a famous translator, a great poet in his own right. His name is Andrew Schelling. He taught at Europa for years, and this is one of my favorite books. This is translated from Indian language, the Sanskrit, and it's about a great monk who's also woman crazy and sensual and has put those two worlds together. So,
for the record, the book that Mike is showing me is Some Unquenchable Desire, Sanskrit Poems of the Buddhist Hermit Bhartrhari.
These are the books that I just wanted to reveal to you, and I am married to a wonderful poet named Mary Johnston Parker, and she's very quiet about her poetry, and I'm hoping she's going to bring out a big book this summer. But our lives are poetry, and I have a daughter who's a senior in high school who's incredibly political and embraces the whole world of gay revolution, black rights, voting rights, all these things that young people are enacting on now. Goes to every possible demonstration in Denver and Boulder, and she and my wife are revolutionary people, and so I have this wonderful life of living in Ward. We keep an apartment in Boulder so she could go to school to Boulder High down there. So she's about to graduate and about to choose a college, and she's going to study international studies and political science, and her dreams of changing the world are working for the State Department and are being in the diplomatic corps. She's a young socialist. She embraces the politics of AOC and Bernie Sanders, and she loves Alexandra Cortez, and she's radical. And so we have this wonderful life, and we put the two of them together, and part of our world is nature, part of our world is still politics, but a big part of our world, my whole family, is poetry. Franny has gone to poetry readings. We've dragged her to poetry readings at Naropa since she was 2 years old, sometimes the only child there. Ann Waldman, the poet who really runs the poetry world down there, has totally embraced my family in such a loving way, and I'm a lucky guy. This is an honor to get to hang with you and just reveal this part of my life. But besides my life, I want you to reveal some of these poets to the world of Netherland, because we're all in this together. We have a union that's that's unspoken of. In Ward, we call our union Ward Area Rural Poets. There's no dues. To be a member, you just have to write a poem. And that's how we embrace the world of poetry. It's a great art form. It has room for everybody and everything. And the last thing I'll show you is these are the two poems I wrote for the issue where they're going to publish local poets. They usually do once a year.
For the record, the poem that Mike is currently showing me is called Bryson, and the poem that he's about to show me is called European Ashes. You can find both of these poems in the June 29th, 2023 edition of The Mountain Ear. European Ashes is available on page 7, and Bryson is available on page 11.
So this is a poem about a great friend of mine that died this year. His name was Bryson, and he was kind of a young Taoist monk. I work with his mom, Suzanne. I work at Nature's Own, the fossil and mineral store in Netherlands. I've worked there for over 20 years. And so I know Bryson through his history, but he was a great martial artist and a Taoist. And so this is a poem in his memory that I wrote. So I would like to publish this poem in there, and it's for him and his family. And this poem, called European Ashes, I wrote on this record album in 1984. I took that old poem and I updated it because the war in Ukraine has revealed another world to us. We are again up to our necks in a Cold War. The Chinese and the Russians have just bonded together. For the first time in my lifetime, there have been threats of using nuclear weapons. It's the first time since the Bay of Pigs happened in Cuba when Kennedy was considering it and the Russians were considering it. It's the first time that people have talked about nuclear war again. That whole world is unstable. Europe, for the first time again, has felt threatened. Russia was threatened by NATO moving its missiles into Poland, Romania, and some of those places. The Cold War never stopped developing. But then you have all these new leaders who have somewhat embraced the idea of us versus them. It's happening now with the Chinese. It certainly has happened with Putin, and we saw Trump embrace that world, but it happened through Obama. It happened through the last 10 presidents. It developed during the war in Iraq. It developed through the Bush family. The Cold War never really went away. It just changed geographies. 9/11 brought it to a head in a new way. Some of the best instincts in America became we tortured people. We did people that we blamed the rest of the world doing for years. Politics became terrible. In not only this country, but in Russia, in the Mideast, them killing journalists, in Thailand, in Burma. It's become so contagious that it has now elevated that fear level again. In 1984, I wrote this poem, European Ashes, that's one of the songs on the Ballistic Kisses album, and it was about the emergence of the Cold War then. People thought the Cold War had gone away. I thought I had an insight into it for the future, and it became true. And this is it now. So I rewrote a couple of the lyrics, and it's about finding peace, because we are in such a dangerous position now. More countries have nuclear missiles. Korea is so dangerous, North Korea. This could happen at any time now. The Russians this week just announced that they were going to expand nuclear weapons into Belarus. The English just announced that they were going to send ammunition that is somewhat radioactive, made out of old weapons, things that can destroy tanks, to the Ukrainians. The first line is, the Cold War is boiling. This thing is coming to a head again. This is a poem against that. So I would like to publish that in the paper just to make people think about peace again and what a dangerous situation we are in. I'm still a conscientious objector at heart. One missile would lead to another missile, would lead to the end, and it's a terrible thing to think about. So this is what I wrote for the paper. It's an honor to be a poet, and it's really an honor to be interviewed, no matter who you are in this world. I found performing in front of wonderful audiences in New York City, in that music world, one of the greatest honors in my life. It's an honor to be an artist. So do what you like with this.
Because Mike was so willing to delve into his life story, I didn't have to ask him a single question throughout this interview. He was so generous to share his time sharing his story with me, and I was incredibly honored to hear it. But to wrap things up, I did have one more question I wanted to ask him, and that question was, do you feel that politics are a big driving force behind what you write?
Yeah, but not only myself, because if you look at the history of modern American poetry, poets have stood up against wars and violence and stood up for women's rights, the rights of black people, the rights of immigrants, the rights of gay people. Allen Ginsberg, that was a central theme of his poetry throughout his whole life, and many of the beat writers. Anne Waldman is an incredibly political performance poet, and unless poets include include that as part of their poetry. You can't just write about nature anymore, because look what's happened to nature. The world has been destroyed by capitalism and by the aftermath of pollution, and you can't divorce nature from politics anymore. All of this is intertwined, and it's the great Buddhist idea of interconnectedness. None of us are alone. All of us are interconnected, whether we like it or not. Nature, the universe, poets, artists, working class people, the worst people and the best people, we are all interconnected. There's nobody that's going to save themselves. The world is interconnected. I find the internet a very double-edged thing, but I find poetry a single-edged sword, because it has embraced the power to do good. It has stood up for the oppressed. It has stood up for nature. My favorite poet in the world is the poet Gary Snyder, who's this incredible nature poet, but was labeled a communist in the 50s for being a nature poet and standing up against war. And poetry has to embrace and encompass all of this. I love the poets, many of whom are not political, but these days, even they have to embrace nature in this new way, or we're not going to have a world. We're looking at what's happened to the element of carbon and what it's doing to the world, and there's no escaping it. We have to change what we do. We have to change how we pollute. We have to change how we pollute consciousness. Capitalism has polluted consciousness in many different ways. Now you got the Chinese embracing it, even though they don't admit it. Russia became an oligarch country. Greed and money are one of the greatest pollutions in the world. Poets share. We embrace each other. I hope by trying to share some of these today, that this interview is not just about me, because there's no me anymore. Me is not the greatest world anymore. It's us. We're all part of this. You're part of this. By coming here today and working for this newspaper, you certainly don't work for this newspaper because of the large amount of money they pay you. We embrace these things because we love it, and because it's right, and because we're involved in change. We're all in this together. And so politics still are in my world. Sometimes picking up a book like this and reading one poem will change your whole day. We're all connected. When people come and go and different people run things, it was a great loss losing Barbara Lawler. She was this really working class person who never went anywhere without a camera in her hand, and embraced the art scene, embraced the local people. She was a true artist with that camera. I love photographers. I loved Robert Mapplethorpe when he was alive, and I love Barbara, and the arts encompass a lot of stuff, and they're a powerful weapon against the things that are wrong with this world. And I'm a great believer in young people, and I'm a great believer in this young generation. Greta was the great voice of the ecological revolution. She turned so many kids on to standing up and being fighters. She's a great fighter, and I have great faith in the young. When I was in my 20s, I was wild. When I was a conscientious objector, nobody was going to scare me out of it. Not the FBI, not the draft board. I thought the Vietnam War was wrong. So many kids in my neighborhood died over there. My brother was over there. But you got to take a stand, and poets have taken a stand, and the world of poetry is still alive, and it's always going to be alive, and it's growing. So thanks for coming by here today. These words are only valuable when they get cast as seeds.
Thank you so much to Mike for coming on board and joining us for the podcast. This episode has been a year in the making. I initially recorded this interview on March 26, 2023, and wrote an article for the paper about Mike on April 28, 2023. So the fact that I finally get to share this interview with the world is incredibly gratifying to me. Be sure to get all of these poetry collections wherever you get your poetry, whether online or in physical stores. Also be sure to head to Middle Creek Publishing and Audio's website at middlecreekpublishing.com to learn more about some of these poets, including Mike Parker and Alexander Shalom Joseph. There are also some websites I wanted to shout out. Hoag Holmgren's website at HOAGHOLMGREN.com, and Alexander Shalom Joseph's website at ALEXANDERSHALOMJOSEPH.com. You can check out both of those websites now and learn more about both of those respective poets. I believe all of these poets have an online presence in some way, even if they don't have an official website. So be sure to go online and check out all of the poets that were mentioned in this episode. Also, I have an upcoming episode with Alexander Shalom Joseph. That episode is coming up in the near future, and you can listen to Scott Harrison's episode of the podcast right now on the Mountaineer website. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you once again, Mike, for celebrating National Poetry Month with us.
And that's it for our show. Subscribe online to get more access to more news, weekly updates to our community calendar, and a link to our YouTube channel by visiting themountaineer.com. Be sure to use the coupon code PODCAST when subscribing for a 10% discount, only available to our listeners. If you are in the local Peak to Peak area, be sure to pick up a print edition of The Mountaineer at a local business. I'm Dango Rose. Thank you for listening.